Okay, so are you ready for this one? This deep dive, it's going to be a wild one.
Oh, yeah.
We're really going deep into Writings at the End of the World by Wesley Gibbs. And let me tell you, this book is intense.
It's something else. It's really not your typical philosophical read. Gibbs does not hold back, like, at all.
Yeah, no, he does not. He's confronting some really, really tough realities about climate change and social injustice and, well, humanity's role in all of it.
Yeah, and you can just feel that urgency in his writing right from the
Mhm.
first page, which makes sense when you consider his background.
Yeah.
Living through that military coup in Thailand, organizing labor unions, seeing firsthand the environmental cost of globalization. It's like he's writing from the front lines.
Yeah, for sure. And he actually talks about how during the coup in Thailand, like just everyday things, even just eating a sandwich could get you arrested. I mean,
It's wild. It really gives you a sense of the tension and fear that people were living under.
absolutely. But then he takes it a step further and connects it to what he sees as this apathy, this, almost like a blindness in Western cultures, especially among those who benefit the most from the very systems that are causing these problems. And he really doesn't sugarcoat it at all. He actually calls these societies a suicide cult, which is, well, that's a pretty jarring statement. Do you think that metaphor is effective, or is it maybe a little too extreme?
I think it speaks to just how urgent Gibbs feels this all
Yeah.
is. But he's not just pointing fingers, though. I think he's really trying to highlight this huge disconnect that exists between our actions and their consequences. It's a way to get people to confront some really uncomfortable truths about their own roles in these systems that are contributing to the problems.
Yeah, and he uses some really, really vivid descriptions and metaphors to really drive his point home. For example, he calls the whole idea of land ownership, like the very concept of it, he calls it a psychotic sickness.
And he really gets into that whole idea, like he's challenging this fundamental notion that any human being can actually own a piece of land. Because, I mean, think about it. Like you don't really own your house if you stop paying taxes on it. Right.
Right.
So he's saying this whole concept of ownership is not only illogical, but it's also at the root of so many of the problems that we're seeing. He sees it as this common thread that connects colonialism, industrial capitalism, and of course the environmental crisis.
Yeah, and it made me think about, he brings up Gerard Winstanley and the Diggers. And if I'm remembering this correctly, they were fighting against land enclosure back in like 17th century England.
Exactly. He points to the Diggers as this early example of resistance against the idea of privatizing what was once common land.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
so he sees that enclosure movement, which is basically where these wealthy landowners just fenced off public land for their own personal use. He sees that as a pivotal moment. It's where this idea of land as property really took hold instead of it being seen as a shared resource.
Yeah, and it's interesting because he even quotes Rousseau, who said, trying to get this right, he said, the first person who, having enclosed a plot of land, took it into his head to say, this is mine, and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. And Gibbs really seems to be suggesting that that's when things started to go wrong.
It's a fascinating point. He uses historical examples like that to show us that the systems that we're living in, they're not inevitable. They're not. They're built on choices that were made a long time ago. And he's arguing that those choices have had some really devastating consequences.
Yeah, and he doesn't shy away from, naming names either. He criticizes some pretty big thinkers like Noam Chomsky, Bill McKibben, even Naomi Klein, saying that they're not radical enough.
Yeah, it's like he's challenging everyone to step up their game. Like,
Mm.
we need to move beyond these theoretical debates and start really embracing some much more radical solutions. And it's interesting, he also criticizes groups like the Green Party and libertarians. He accuses them of sheepdogging and using these purity tests.
What does he mean by when he says sheepdogging in this context?
So he's suggesting that these groups, while they claim to be advocating for change, they actually end up just maintaining the status quo because they're basically hurting people away from more radical action. It's like he sees their focus on ideological purity and all the infighting. It's like a distraction from the actual work that needs to be done.
So he's saying that no one is off the hook, not even the, I don't know, like the usual suspects when we're talking about environmentalism and social justice.
Exactly. He's critical of what he sees as this complacency across the board, this sense of just kind of accepting the way things are, like it's inevitable. And he even pushes back against this whole idea of us just accepting climate change, like we just have to accept it. And that's it.
He even quotes Huey Newton saying, it is better for me to oppose the forces that would drive me to self murder than to endure them. I mean, That's a really powerful statement. What do you think he's getting at there?
I think it speaks to this idea of like active resistance. Even when it feels like you're facing impossible odds, Gibbs is really advocating for this refusal to be complicit in a system that he sees as inherently self-destructive. It's about fighting for a different future, even if it means challenging everything we thought we knew and confronting these really uncomfortable truths.
Yeah, and this really ties into his whole critique of colonialism, which he talks about a lot in the book. He spends a lot of time kind of tracing these historical roots of the predicament that we're in now.
Yeah.
He points to things like the English enclosure movement and the writings of John Locke and the rise of industrial capitalism as these key factors.
He argues that colonialism, with this whole mentality of just like extraction and exploitation, it basically created the blueprint for how we interact with the planet today. It's this relationship built on domination and control instead of respect and reciprocity.
And he seems really interested in the impact that these historical forces have had on indigenous populations and their ways of life.
Absolutely. So Gibbs actually challenges that common narrative, the one that we all kind of learned growing up,
Yeah.
that indigenous societies were primarily hunter-gatherers. He presents a totally different perspective on their relationship with the environment. Like he talks about these sophisticated land management practices
Mm.
of indigenous cultures. In North America specifically,
Yeah.
he's suggesting they had this much more nuanced and sustainable approach to living on the land.
He even says that, and this is hard to imagine, but he says that North America was covered in this vast network of roads and like these meticulously managed landscapes before colonization, which is definitely different from what most of us were taught in school, right?
Right. And to support this, he highlights just how devastating colonization was for these cultures and these practices. He's arguing that the destruction of indigenous ways of life is directly linked to the ecological crisis that we're facing right now.
Yeah, and he has this one quote from an unnamed indigenous author, but it really stuck with me. It says, "Native people don't have claims to land. They have land. It's their land. Some of you others might have claims to land." Like it really gets to the heart of this fundamental difference in perspective.
Totally. And it connects to this idea that he keeps coming back to, that we need to reclaim our own indigenous pasts if we even want to begin to get out of this mess. But it's like easier said than done. What does that even look like?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's easy to say, reclaim our indigenous pasts, but how do you actually do that in a
Hmm.
world where those ways of life have been almost completely destroyed?
I think for Gibbs, it starts with a shift in consciousness,
Yeah.
like a reevaluation of how we see ourselves in relation to the natural world, recognizing that we're not separate from nature, but a part of it. And he suggests that indigenous cultures offer us this different way of seeing and being in the world, one that's based on interconnectedness and respect for all forms of life.
And he gives some really, like, I don't know, almost like scary examples of how far we've strayed from that. Like, did you know that the biomass of wild animals has plummeted since the Industrial Revolution?
It's crazy. He talks about how, yeah, the biomass of wild animals has just absolutely plummeted, while the biomass of humans and livestock has skyrocketed. It's like this really stark visual,
Mm.
of how we've come to dominate the planet at the expense of every other species.
It's kind of terrifying when you think about it that way. And he uses this word, watiko, to describe this force that he sees driving all this destruction. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, so Wetiko is a term that some indigenous cultures use to describe this like insatiable greed or like a cannibalistic spirit that just consumes everything in its path. And it's a powerful metaphor for this way that Gibbs sees humanity like literally devouring the planet
Hmm.
and ultimately, devouring itself.
That's a pretty bleak picture he's painting. I mean, is there any room for hope in his view? Or is it all just doom and gloom?
He definitely doesn't shy away from the harsh realities.
Hmm.
But I do think he offers a glimmer of hope because he argues that even when things seem impossible, we still have a responsibility to resist, to fight for something better.
Mm-hmm.
He reminds us that even if we can't completely prevent climate change, our actions still matter. Like every little bit helps. Every degree of warming we can mitigate, every species we can save, it all makes a difference.
So it's about finding ways to live in greater harmony with nature.
Exactly. He sees the solutions not in some kind of technological quick fix,
Hmm.
but in a fundamental shift in our values and our relationship with the planet. It's about creating a more sustainable way of life, one that prioritizes the well-being of all beings, not just ourselves.
So where do we even go from here? Like if these systems are so deeply entrenched, how do we even start to shift our values and create a future where we're actually living in harmony with the planet?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And
Oh,
Gibbs
boy.
acknowledges that. Like, he doesn't pretend to have all the answers, But he does suggest that we need to start by at least acknowledging our own complicity, in these systems that are causing so much harm.
Right. He talks about how it's not enough to just offer grief counseling to people who are struggling with climate anxiety. In fact, he almost seems more concerned about the grief visited on the rest of the world by, and I'm quoting here, newly traumatized imperial instigators.
It's like he's saying we need to stop focusing on making ourselves feel better and start acknowledging the very real harm that's been done to people and the planet.
So he's talking about those who have benefited the most from these systems.
Right.
He's saying they need to really take responsibility for the damage that's been caused.
Exactly. And he really pushes back against this idea that we should avoid placing blame. He says that pretending everyone is equally responsible actually just lets the worst offenders off the hook. He even says at one point, there is blame. There is a hell of a lot of blame. Like he's not mincing words,
Wow, yeah, he definitely doesn't. It's a tough thing to hear, though, for those of us who, even if it's indirectly, have benefited from these systems. It's much easier to just focus on what we can do as individuals, like reducing our carbon footprint, rather than really confronting these huge systemic issues.
I get that. And he acknowledges that individual actions are important, but he's saying they're not enough. We need collective action. We need people to come together and really challenge these systems from the ground up.
He talks a lot about his time as a labor organizer and how he learned that sometimes you have to disrupt things in order to make real change.
Exactly. He's saying that change rarely happens without a fight.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to challenge those in power, to disrupt the status quo. And yeah, he even suggests that sometimes violence may be necessary, which is a really uncomfortable thing to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this. Like when you really start to think about the scale of these problems, it's almost paralyzing, isn't it?
It can be.
Hmm.
But I think that's why Gibbs emphasizes this idea of hope and the power of collective action. He's saying we need to resist that urge to just give up. We have to believe that a different world is possible, and then we have to fight for it together.
He quotes Victor Serge, the Russian revolutionary, who said, "Whether here or there matters little so long as one lays it down on the great day for the awakening of the oppressed." It's like he's calling for a revolution, but not just a political one, a revolution of consciousness.
Yeah, a complete
Yeah.
paradigm shift. And I think he sees that shift as being essential, not just for the health of the planet, but for our own well-being as well,
So it's about more than just saving the environment. It's about creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our liberation is inseparable from the liberation of the planet.
It's a powerful idea, but how do we actually make it happen? What can we do as individuals?
That's where things get really interesting, because Gibbs doesn't offer any easy answers. He encourages everyone to find their own path, to figure out how they can use their unique skills and passions to contribute, and to not get discouraged if they don't see immediate results. He says the work is there to be done, and the work will be its own reward. It's a call to action for sure.
Well, I have to say, Writings at the End of the World is not an easy read, but it's a really important one. Gibbs forces us to take a long, hard look in the mirror and confront some uncomfortable truths. But he also offers a glimmer of hope, right? A vision of a different way of being in the world.
I think that's what makes his work so compelling. He's not afraid to be provocative, to challenge our assumptions, but at the heart of it, it's a message of hope and a call to action. He's reminding us that we all have a role to play in creating a better future.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap things up for today's deep dive. If you're ready to explore these ideas further, we highly recommend checking out Gibbs' book. It's a challenging read, but it will definitely give you a lot to think about. And that's what we're all about here. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep diving deep.